So all of this that I present is on their behalf. I represent Studio Lotus, currently. So all of this that I present is on their behalf. I represent Studio Lotus, currently. So all of this that I present is on their behalf. I represent Studio Lotus, currently. So all of this that I present is on their behalf. I represent Studio Lotus, currently. So all of this that I present is on their behalf. I represent Studio Lotus, currently a team of about 110 working out of our studio in New Delhi. Even as we enter the 21st year of our practice, we still start each day slightly unsure, slightly unsteady, as we navigate our way through projects of different scales and typologies, mostly work that comes to us, exploring different ways of working to address emerging challenges. Through the early years of our practice, as we struggled to find ways to make a living, we found ourselves working much in the mainstream of commercial and private commissions. One thing that seemed to drive us was to day after day find new ways of pushing beyond the expected in whatever it is we were working on, small shops, offices, or a home, where the common theme was linked to limited budgets and timelines, and our way of overcoming this was to search and harness whatever limited resource we had access to around us. For those of you who are not familiar with the context of India, though most of you here would be, this map shows the incredible density of its population. With a population 4 times that of the US, the little red state of Uttar Pradesh on the map on the right has a population that exceeds the entire population of the United States. Yet, India's total carbon emissions are currently nearly half that of the US, though rapidly rising. Its per capita carbon emission is 1/7 that of the US at 2 tons of CO2 per person versus 15 tons per person here, but rapidly climbing as we get developed. Should India's per capita consumption rise to the US's level, global carbon footprint would rise to an earth-crushing 150% of current levels. Mahatma Gandhi seemed to have predicted this way back at the time of India's independence. Going a little deeper into understanding the region, even at 1/3 the area of the US, India has nearly the same number of climatic zones, making it incredibly diverse, with 21 agroecological regions, which results in amongst the most diverse regional cuisines in the world, based entirely on local and seasonal produce. Culturally, there are over 2,000 documented artisanal craft forms still alive across the country, even though a lot of them are rapidly fading. And 400 living languages with thousands of dialects still alive. We are many countries in one. Our traditional lifestyles, mostly still vibrant and alive, has been based on strong regional responses, creating multiple cultures that live in harmony with their context, richly diverse, highly local, impacting language, ritual, food, clothing, and of course, building. A few examples, such as in Kerala, on the southern coast with its hot and humid climate, where people's clothing is as porous and ventilated as the buildings they inhabit. The food they eat promotes cooling in the body, and a majority of the population still lives comfortably without aircon. Or here in the Himalayan desert of Ladakh, with its cold and dry climate, where the high thermal mass of the mud walls with small windows and yak wool and fur keeps people warm with very little artificial heating, while the salt butter tea keeps the skin supple and hydrated. Or then the western hot and dry deserts of Kutch and Rajasthan, where straw bale roofs and adobe walls in the buildings and the layers of white hand-spun cotton on people keep the cool in and the heat out, as the spicy food keeps the sweat glands active. And now we are rapidly on the road to development, becoming globalized, causing a homogenization of our aspirations as the global south seeks to play catch up. in our buildings, our food, our clothing, right down to the standards of comfort we aspire to, readily discarding indigenous wisdom imbibed over centuries. What then can we do differently? Can we find ways to interpret the wisdom that surrounds us in a way that speaks to our collective futures? In our own little way, we've tried to do this through our practice as we've discovered values that begin to shape our work. We've always been a country of frugal means of doing more with less. How do we build in a way that keeps handmade relevant at increasingly larger scales? Can we design passive and low tech versus going for high tech, bringing innovation within reach to a larger spectrum of projects? Reusing beyond just preserving built historic structures and increasingly adapting ordinary structures for the embodied carbon. What does it take to do buildings that endure and that people continue to love over generations? A lot of our clients are wealthy individuals and luxury brands. We recognize that we have a chance to influence aspirations for the mainstream to create pride in the local and not the imported. And for that, digging into the huge repository of craft that our country offers, and to create beauty using indigenous techniques. Lastly, we continue to engage with how could we tread lightly on the ground in a manner that's both physical and metaphorical. I'm going to take you through a few examples showing how we've attempted in our own little way to address some of these questions. One of our earliest projects 18 years ago was a small store for a leading Indian fashion designer at a luxury mall in New Delhi. This mall was the first home to the then new to India foreign luxury brands. These neighboring stores had budgets for interior fit-outs that were almost 9 times as much as what we were given. And not only that, we had only 90 days to design and execute the store. We took inspiration from Rajesh's design approach of using handcrafted artisanal techniques to create texture on his clothes, and used a small team of ordinary welders, much like Rajesh uses his tailors to create texture and pattern. They hand-welded 12,000 scissors into 12 different patterns. These were mounted onto individual metal frames off-site and bolted on-site onto a light metal framework, which was inserted into a simple painted shell. All the services, air conditioning and electricals ran outside of this lattice. The clothes were framed by this lace-like filigree. As you can see on the image on the right, the imperfections of the hand welding only added further tactility to the space. This was a fairly successful project in many ways, budget-wise and time-wise, and most importantly, in delivering a distinct brand proposition using a frugal, handmade approach. We scaled this understanding to a different level when we had the opportunity of working for a client, building a boutique hotel that later spread across various regions in India, which gave us a chance to interpret an approach of regional luxury in different contexts. The first of these was on a site in the walled city of Jodhpur in Rajasthan on a 6,000 square meter plot with 3 derelict, unlisted 17th century buildings, as you can see on the image on the right. Access to the site was through these narrow lanes, inaccessible by construction trucks. The lanes brought us to this old gate, which revealed this spectacular view. The 3 old buildings had multiple families living in them prior to us taking it over, who had modified them crudely over time and left them with little semblance of the original architecture. The program demanded 40 rooms. Our site plan looked at restoring the 3 old buildings as anchors, the public spaces with a restaurant, pool, and spa, and then build the rooms around them as 3 new buildings, which would retain the relationship of the old buildings with a central courtyard and the fort at the back. The first block thus became the second gateway to the site after the main gate, and the rear 2 blocks became the canvas for these 3 historic buildings, which in turn visually connect to the fort. We identified what could be removed from the existing buildings, peeling away layers of paint, removing new interventions, restoring traditional details in stone and lime till the jewel-like form of these buildings emerged, and started reconnecting the shared history in conversation with the fort. The second more challenging part was designing the new blocks in a contemporary idiom. These buildings had to be west-facing because of the views, We designed them as double skin structures like the traditional ventilated double skin Charoka structures of the region. And the development of the elevation, this is one of the new blocks. The fort-facing balconies outer skin could only be 20 millimeters thick, light enough to make the stone panels openable. We began by referencing traditional patterns for this elevation, which in 20 mil thickness could only have been achieved through a CNC machine cut process, because hand carvers needed a minimum 50 mil to work with. In fact, the CNC process might have even been faster at a similar cost. However, the client and us wanted to stay true to the handcrafting process and chose instead to modify the elevation to a simpler, more graphic pattern, which eventually, of course, worked out better than what we'd imagined, as it gave us a very graphic contemporary elevation that you see in the image on the right, which then became not only a part of the balconies, but also the naturally ventilated circulation spaces, negotiating privacy and transparency, and infusing these buildings with a changing quality of light and shadow cast by the sharp desert sun through different times of the day. The most challenging bit was detailing the openable stone balcony shutter, 420 kilos of stone that needed to be moved by a guest, which was developed with local mill workers to create this dynamic facade, which guests interact with through the day and changes. And at night, the stone becomes like fabric, and the three new buildings become lanterns, framing the site. To breathe life into the smooth quarry-cut sandstone slabs, we turned to the craftsmen at site, and over multiple prototypes generated hand-chiseled patterns, which was translated onto the stone walls. You can see the image on the left, which are 50 mil thick, 3 meter high solid stone partitions that divide the bathroom and the room, or the solid sandstones, hand-cut perforated headboards, which also serve as nightlights. The project overall creates a dialogue between the old and the new, a seamless experience of history and the present. We realized through working on this project that when you have your ears to the ground and engage with local artisans on site, working with materials of the region, you truly tap into the potential of the site. Our more recent studies on embodied energy showed us that the same lattice stone panel, when it is handmade, is about 1/6 of the embodied energy as a similar CNC machine tooled one. In addition, you get the socio-cultural impact it has on reinvigorating traditional skill in the community, and of course, the very special organic feeling which only the handmade can give, all at the same cost as the machine-made, something that can still only happen in India. It is important to note here that for us to tap into this hidden potential, we needed to move beyond the comfort of our drawing boards, trust the process and wisdom of the artisans and other stakeholders at site, and be willing to let them co-author the final outcome. I'll take you to a totally different context for the same client to build a 40-room hotel in Dharamshala, a region which is the home of the Dalai Lama up in the Himalayas. This project is still under construction, with spectacular views of the Himalayas to the north and of the tea-growing valley to the south. The architecture here takes a totally different form while celebrating the same values of contemporizing the vernacular. The building is designed to straddle a ridge, and we use the contours of the hill to create a single 220-meter-long building with 40 rooms. The red vertical spines that you see here are individual staircases that lead to the rooms in the yellow band above and below the blue band, which at the ground level houses all the public amenities. The way the rooms have no corridor, this way the rooms have no corridor on any side and have balconies on both sides to enjoy uninterrupted views of the mountains on the north and the valley on the south, whilst being totally private from each other. The building is inspired and formed by the powerful yet silent rhythm of a Buddhist monastery, whereas the materiality is derived from the local village homes and temples of the region. We used waste slate from local mines, and the group of masons who had worked with us in Rajasthan came in and honed their skills with the local Himachali masons to build the sweeping form within 6 months of the 200-meter-long thick masonry walls that gives the building thermal mass for radiant heating and give it its timeless expression that captures the rhythm and materiality that we sought to express. The southern face of the roof is entirely skinned with solar panels, feeding the heat pumps, a view of the building showing it as it peels away from the sloping hill and sits against the mountains. I think engaging deeply with the site here and a vernacular process gave the building its eventual form that spoke to our aspirations of giving it a timeless expression. The film that shows a sense of the scale of the building as it's taking shape. I'll now move on to the third project we did for the same client in a slightly different context, just to show how this transitions. This is between Jodhpur and Jaipur in Rajasthan, on an 800-acre rewilded forest, a bioreserve on a private estate, with a 200-year-old rainwater check dam on which the original owners used to run a 12-tented property. This was seasonal, business was unviable, and our clients entered into a JV with the family to convert it into a perennial property. We opted for a simple curvilinear plan on the dam, taking the room count up to 16, with the public amenities upgraded at the right corner of the dam, which could be serviced and accessed independently. Due to the fragile nature of the 200-year-old dam, we needed to create a building that was almost as light as the original tents and used no concrete. The section shows how we sunk the circulation on the forest side of the dam. This gives guests uninterrupted private balconies towards both the lake-facing sunrise and the forest-facing sunsets. We had only 8 months to build out the whole project and designed a very light foundation system, precast hewn pipes filled with stone and lime, of which the elevated framework for all the tents is taken off. This allows us to run all the services under the slab without digging the topsoil. So the roof is a double-layered waterproof canvas, heat-reflecting canvas skin that creates overhangs for shade on either side. That's the sunken path to approach the rooms. You move up, you enter the tent, and the lake gets revealed, taking forward the idea of unfolding thresholds from the Ras narrative. For the interiors, we reinvented the tradition of block printing of the region and worked with a young GSD-trained printmaker who spent weeks on site sketching the flora and fauna of the region, interpreted them into these very large hand-carved wooden blocks, which are 6 to 8 feet tall, and used to transfer print the linen onto the linen for the tents. Further hand-embroidered these with migratory birds and animals that come to site, and each tent had different compositions. We took the same narrative onto the furniture, hand-carving the casings for the air conditioning units, custom designing the camp-style furniture, getting it made in the native kikar wood, and how all these come together as happy surprises of varying composition. A view of the tent looking towards the forest where you enter from, a skylight that frames the brilliant night sky over the bed, and in winter lets shafts of sunlight in, the view towards the lake, where you step out onto a private garden. As you move onto the lake in a boat, you see the building lightly perched on the dam, and towards the right, you see the reception bar and restaurant building. In form inspired by the traditional pavilions of the region, the building is lightly perched off the dam with a wraparound veranda and a pool on the sunken side of the dam which cascades down into a traditional stepwell at the entry plaza. The construction system uses no concrete and is a composite of hand-carved sandstone clamped onto steel. Wherever the people touch the stone, it has a hand-chiseled texture. The air conditioning grills are cut by hand at site. This is how the building sits on the dam, the veranda with its sunrise view, the courtyard between the baradari and the tents. The interior again borrows on the same narrative of textiles, but interpreted as hand-chiseled patterns on stone, as you can see on the image on the right. Also translated into the hand-carved bar unit with migratory flamingos that visit the lake in winter. The sundowner veranda overlooking the forest. The kitchen block made of reclaimed stone that we got from site as we dug up the foundations of the old tent. the stepwell that around an old temple that existed at site, which blesses all guests as they arrive and depart. Together with the owners, we found a way of keeping the women from the neighboring villages actively engaged in the upkeep of the decor through traditional decorations, landscape inserts with much modern lines, such as these hand-painted rangoli patterns in the courtyards, and numbering of the rooms that have to be redone every few weeks. A video that captures the experience of being at the site. I'd like to move back again to the Himalayas, this time to Uttarakhand, where we worked with a 100-acre site, the passion project of a client who loved the hills and wanted to develop an eco-conscious gated community. The biggest problem in these hills is the rampant unplanned construction and the torrential rain together, which causes severe erosion and landslides. And in spite of that, ironically, a scarcity of water for human consumption. Together with the landscape architects, we developed a master plan, first mapping natural water runoffs and green belts, around which we developed our road networks and the location for the houses and the hotel, an ecology-first approach, which got translated on site in the manner in which these roads were cut, with minimal cut and fill and very small dry gabion retaining walls. Slope stabilization was done using bioengineering methods of hydroseeding, bamboo crib walls, and brush layering through the entire site. For water retention and management, we built 300 micro check dams of dry stone, which have been created across all the swales on site, which over a period of 3 years alone have not only retained water for the site, but have regenerated artisanal wells of the villages downstream, which were dry for years. This has begun to revive the entire ecosystem of underground aquifers, creating a remarkable transformation. The houses themselves are collection points for rainwater, and the water that's collected from the rooftop of one home gets used by the home downstream through a gravity-fed network. The wastewater too gets recycled similarly. We've tried to build in areas which are non-productive, on slopes virtually impossible to build in traditional methods of construction. For this, we developed a construction technique with almost no cut and fill, with minimal alteration of the slope of the site. To ensure the surrounding trees and slopes do not get damaged, this construction methodology does not need cranes or heavy machinery. This model shows the very strong basket-like weave of 100 mm cross-section steel pipes, which creates the superstructure such that each module is less than 100 kilos, enabling 4 people to move each module for assembly, and the whole frame gets used as scaffolding by itself. The superstructure stilts the house off the ground, allowing rainwater to flow through, and a multi-layered dry construction system with minimal concrete creates a highly insulated shell that achieves passive house benchmarks. The structure could be erected rapidly, with the trees around all intact, timber and slate as the facade rain screens. You can see the weave of the metal structure expressed on the outside and the inside as the walls slice through. Hand-carved details by local craftsmen welcome you into the house. The outside and the inside connect strongly, both in terms of the way the house connects with the courtyards and the way the balconies perch out into the trees. the house encapsulated within the trees as it disappears within the forest, which was the primary intent. I'll quickly move back to Rajasthan for a project in the historic city palace of Jaipur, where we had an opportunity to refurbish a small cafeteria within the precinct of the City Palace Museum. The brief was to refurb this space to create a new destination for tourists and locals alike that kept it really basic and simple in the past. We proposed re-articulating the central courtyard by replacing a vestigial service block that had been added later to open up and put in a new connecting pavilion to connect the city and the museum so that the space becomes another connector for the City Palace after closing hours. We began to strip off layers of cement, plaster, and paint from relatively poor renovations that had been done over time to reveal the spectacular stone masonry beneath, which we repaired using lime mortar made at site. Before and after images here show how the reinterpretation worked, what lay beneath, which gave us delightful transformations. An old office block got converted into a private lounge. The building started to speak of the history through their materials. We conceptualized a lightweight contemporary pavilion that anchored the two courtyards, the housing and island bar within, made entirely in a lightweight metal frame and handcrafted local marble, which was honed down to a thickness which made it translucent and gave form in a new vocabulary that was regional yet contemporary. Traditional art forms such as stickery mirrorwork is reinterpreted in graphic motifs to create new narratives of craft reinvented. The finished space, reimagined, gives the city a new watering hole that looks to the future while celebrating its past. Another small project in the same city with a different concern, where we were asked by a leading jeweler to build a new retail store for her. We were handed a plot where the structure had been recently built by the client. She was unhappy with the way the building was shaping up, brought us in, and wanted us to bring it down and rebuild it afresh. While it was very tempting for us to build ground up, free of limitations, the structure itself was in good shape, and it felt criminal to waste all this freshly built concrete. We retained the entire structure, reshaped the slabs, scooped out connections, and created this building, which has a museum on the ground floor, a retail space on the lower ground, and a proposed cafe on the top chorus floor with views of the city. The handcrafted stone facade echoes the Indo-Sasanic roots of the city's architecture and is a synthesis of the Deco, Mughal, and Rajput styles, all of which have influenced the region. The feeling continues to the interior. Here, the multiple retail domes were defined by frescoes, which were done on ceilings by miniature artists who usually work on the scale of an A4 sheet of paper. It took several months of prototyping and us working closely with them to work on curved ceiling forms at a scale they were totally unfamiliar with, to create spectacular hand-painted narratives from the gardens of the region in the multiple zones as you meander through the stores. The project thus becomes a contemporary handmade symbol that speaks of the brand's narrative, bridging the contemporary and the traditional. We've taken this idea into a project where we began to explore a building that could be reshaped as per emerging needs. This is a competition we won for a new visitor center, which Rahul spoke about, at the Mehrangarh Fort in Jodhpur, to be built at the base of the fort. The building is proposed as an entirely naturally ventilated pavilion that stills of the rocky valley such that it doesn't alter the natural flow of rainwater. The project is currently under construction. In section, the building gets sunken into a valley that exists south of the entry road. The roof aligns with the entry road leading to the fort, thus becoming a gateway below the datum of the old structure. The new building is sited in place of an old structure that had to be partly demolished, as the purpose it had been built for had changed. We took a cue of this and proposed looking at the new building as an adaptable system of metal and local stone without the use of any bonding agents, where the building could be reshaped, dismantled, moved, and reconfigured for new use that might emerge in the future. The system uses less than 1/3 the amount of stone as a solid stone masonry building, which is prevalent in the region. The woven modular steel structure is designed so that it can be reconfigured and is designed to take in stone panels 3.2 meters tall, 50 millimeters thick, either as insulated double-skinned walls or brise-soleil screens. The building is made with horizontal shelves and lintels that slide in as a system of assembly that can be disassembled if needed. The flooring consists of perforated stone slabs slotted onto metal frame that allows rain to flow through into the hillside. The building under construction. This lightweight technique allowed us to retain the trees which slice through the structure, how the building sits perched lightly on the edge of the slope, the sun-shaded lattice walls that create a porous, naturally ventilated space. Artisans again breathe life into the smooth, quarry-cut stone slabs. This project to us is a prototype which appropriates engineering and craft as a synergetic whole to create a system that's rooted in the region, yet possibly creates solutions that are forward-looking. Like I mentioned earlier, such projects have brought to us a learning that a classical determinist model where the architect is the author and directs everyone to follow his or her instructions allows lesser degrees of freedom for other stakeholders to contribute to the creative process. Rather than a more participatory model, slightly more emergent that allows all the stakeholders to shape the final outcome. This process needs our drawings and approach to be flexible enough to allow for an improvement or contribution at each stage of the project, which is difficult but immensely rewarding. Over time, we've come to learn that to make it come alive, what's more important than the design vision is a process that empowers and engages people deeply. And that's something we've tried to build into the design of the studio itself over time. We've realized that design driven primarily by principals or partners has its own limitations. Initially, we looked at processes of collaboration to include team members, clients, contractors, and consultants. And we've slowly tried to begin thinking of the studio as something that doesn't have borders, that's alive beyond the walls and team members of the studio, and express it through our values that get seeded in different stakeholders who become our partners in thought. For instance, we work extensively with Studio Lotus alumni as an extended network. Our contractors, artisans, and vendors all become part of the process. The more boundaries we remove, the more we are able to include. To create alignment, we've articulated a set of internal guiding principles that guide us as a team that we've evolved over the years. This is the glue that binds us together. To give you a sense of how we've defined these, I'll just walk you through a couple of them. So for instance, the idea of trust is critical for the process. And we believe that each person will strive to do their best, given the opportunity to do so. So our focus becomes on creating the right conditions for this to happen within the studio and in the project. Another one is this idea of genius as a collective act, which you can only do when you view the people you work with not as a means to achieve your vision, but as contributors to the process itself. This is something that has become a cornerstone for our studio, where we attempt to harness the genius of all the people we work with. To illustrate this more clearly, I'll share one last project where we had the opportunity to design offices for the Department of Agriculture for the state of Odisha, which included a farmers' learning center. We suggested to the clients opening this facility to the citizens of Bhubaneswar and did so by lifting all the offices up and freeing up the ground plane to create a free-flowing space where at the stilt level, while the top 3 floors are offices, the ground plane opens up to the street by sharing amenities such as a library, auditorium, training rooms, a cafeteria, exhibition gallery, and the gardens, of course. This can then be used for events, workshops, and for people to wander through well after offices close after 5 p.m., late into the evening. While the architecture of the building is visually striking, one of the things I'll briefly talk about is this idea of adaptive thermal comfort, which came into play strongly as we understood it better. We've been trying to move away from this idea of a common benchmark set by organizations that deals in standards. In India and elsewhere, most current debates are about raising set points of aircon from 22 to 26 or even 27. The question, though, is comfort for whom? If you see these 2 people, one in Kashmir and one in Kerala, they clearly have different expectations of thermal comfort. When you begin to understand where you are building and who you're building for, you can set the standards of comfort based on the past and present context. When we dress appropriately and are in tune with our bodies and the outdoors, our body is actually comfortable with lesser variations in temperature. For Bhubaneswar, where this building is sited, we found this temperature to be in the vicinity of 29 to 30 degrees even in the shade, with a slow moving wind speed of 1 meter per second hitting our skin through fans. We designed a night purging system for 85% of the building, which used a drop of 12 degrees between morning and evening temperatures in the peak of summer as the cool night air becomes our cooling device. The building has a high thermal mass, so in the evening when the office is shut and the outside temperatures fall, the cool air is drawn into the building. It gets stored in the walls, furniture, partitions. The warm air gets sucked out through the solar chimneys towards the courtyard. In the day, these vents close once the temperatures begin to rise. Fans come on when people walk in, and the thermal mass of the building acts like a giant cooling sink. Post-occupancy analysis has shown success in peak conditions to meet IMAX standards for the region. More importantly, we're able to achieve operating energy benchmarks, which are 1/3 of what are set as national green building, which are the national Indian green building targets for office buildings for 2030. Here you can see all the corridors, which are naturally ventilated, shaded, and the building with its courtyard morphology. I'll move to the identity of the building. The facade pattern is a strong identity derived from the Ikat textile weaves of the region. We used 4 colors of brick representing the 4 colors of soil of the state as louvers which shape the glazing and give identity to the building, creating a graphic expression that celebrates the region. Moving away from the usual aspiration for contemporarization through steel and glass, we convinced the government to give patronage to a body of regional skills and craft at an architectural scale. It was interesting for us to find out that most artisans in the region are farmers who work as artisans in the non-farming season. We were fortunate to find a local architect from Bhubaneswar to run this part of the project for us. We set the brief, created the canvas of the public spaces, and left it to them, to him and the craftspeople, to own the project. For this to succeed, we really had to let go of control and engage in a more collaborative fashion. They created narratives around mythology, around agriculture, all related to the theme of the land and something familiar to the locals, such as these condylite stone lotuses that get cast into slabs, to the way our service shafts are screened in hand-carved stone lattices, the way large dead walls are carved in situ with larger-than-life paddy crop, the Bastar metalwork of that region used as screens and lighting devices and as building signage, and how the building sits in the context of the city. I'm going to leave you all with a video of the experience of the craftsmen who worked on the project.
We were quite excited, with the quantum of work that could be generated if artisans, if craft and architecture come together. And I think that has been a big achievement. That this building project would generate work for about 50 artisans for a continuous 6 months. And we actually got artisans who had stopped working with the traditional suits. We convinced them to come back and to start working again.
ଯେଉଁମାନେ ବି ଆମ ସାଥିରେ କାମ କରୁଥିଲେ ସେମାନେ ବି ସେମିତି ନିର୍ଦ୍ଦିଷ୍ଟ ଗୋଟିଏ କାମ ଭିତରେ ରହିକି ତାଙ୍କର ଚିନ୍ତାଧାରାଟା ସେ ଗୋଟିଏ ଭିତରେ ରହିଥିଲା। ନିର୍ଦ୍ଦିଷ୍ଟ ମୂର୍ତ୍ତି ବନେଇବାରେ ତାଙ୍କ ଚିନ୍ତାଧାରାଟା ସେତିକି ଭିତରେ ସୀମିତ ଥିଲା, ଯାହାଫଳରେ ଏଇ କାମଟା କୃଷି ଭବନ କାମ କରିବା ପରେ ଆମମାନଙ୍କୁ ଦେଖାଗଲା ଯେ ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ଆମେ ଆମ କଳାଟାକୁ କେମିତିକା ଅନ୍ୟ ଦୃଷ୍ଟିରେ ବି ଦେଖିପାରିବା। It's a perfect setting for us where we could bring in artisans and craft. If you talk of farmers and if you talk about people coming from villages to this building, then you want to show them something that's familiar to their environment, and that is where craft comes in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambrish. No, please, don't go away. We've got about 15 or 20 minutes, so I think we have some time for questions. So I'm going to open it up and then maybe ask some myself. So anyone has questions, comments? Okay, there.
Thank you very much for that. Ambrish, what do young architects in India respond to when they see this? Do they want to build steel and glass, or is this something they like when they're studying and they move on to the realities of business? What's unfolding in India? A comment I heard from the head of the National Disaster Management Authority a few years ago: a large percentage of India in 2040 is still not been built. Are we going to build like this, or will we build more fast?
In terms of just, thank you for asking that. In terms of, I think, how young architects respond, I think they're extremely excited. I think it gives them a different vision of directions they could follow. I think what they're most concerned with, it immediately gets followed by a but where do we find the patronage? And, and I think that's what you also referred to. So the patronage for a lot of what India is going to get built like comes from developers. Even from, even for this last project, we faced a tremendous amount of resistance from the government bodies. It was only because the chief minister had given a mandate to give us a free hand and we could engage with, maybe a more progressive bureaucrats that we were able to do this. But having said that, once this got built, then the entire kind of bureaucracy, the project managers, they were all so excited because they could see a new vision for their own, state. So, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of just young architects, they're extremely excited.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, I think the importance of this, and just to make a pitch for the book and to talk about young practices, the precedence is what actually, if you have a critical mass of precedents like this, then whether it's for patrons or for other young architects, it becomes sort of inspiration.
Hi. This is just incredible. I think I'm very inspired. I'm an architect and developer from Nairobi, Kenya, and I work in affordable housing. And I think the endorsement by the patronage team and the government always comes with a halo effect. So once they see it's done, then they love it. But I think on the development side, we are governed by numbers. So I can immediately see that I could quantify that this added amount of effort in artisans and the extra labor would add this much premium in value. This much extra thought in climate would add this much value in the long run. So I'm wondering, apart from sort of like the sort of long suffering journey of architects, is there a way we can begin to link to these precedents in a way that then young practices again can build on that? And have you been doing that kind of work of sort of helping the value be extracted beyond having to sort of, as I said, go through the long suffering journey? Thank you.
So thank you for asking that. It's you'd be surprised that the building you saw last was actually under the budget that they'd allocated for. Actually, they commissioned 3 new buildings, and had we built to spec of what they'd spec, the building would have been more expensive. Because just simple things like the installed air conditioning cost, for instance, we brought it down by 60%. Artisans don't cost much. So they had an arts budget, which we converted into a crafts budget, which actually, and when you added up all the numbers, it was under what they'd estimated. So to that degree, it was just how the money was used. And of course, it was painful, being the architect for the project. But beyond that, when we got our further commissions with the government, we've had an easy, kind of relatively easy time. A lot of resistance, because there is this idea of progress, and really catching up with the image of what progress means, and that we still continue to encounter, and that continues to be a much bigger challenge, really.
Thanks, Ambrish. To me, it seems that more than just the material kind of consideration of craft, there's also a deliberate slowing down in the process and the kind of time that it takes to effectively iterate and work and build on these processes. I'm curious if you see that as a part of your process and a kind of active resistance to fast-paced construction, and whether that's a boundary that you've faced when working with clients, the kind of demands for fast construction versus a more deliberate, careful kind of process.
It's a risk we choose to take, and we pretend we know what the building is going to look like. So actually, all the projects you saw, our drawings on presentations and the elevations we made were nothing like what the buildings turned out to be. So we kind of con the clients into pretending we know what we're doing. And then we go to site and then say, but this is better. And so actually it doesn't, the increment on time is very little. It's just that it is risky, but it's a measured kind of risk. And for instance, once you develop a relationship with a client, say for instance, the hotel client who now kind of has faith in it, he actually doesn't want a finished elevation. So he's happy to go with a conceptual idea, and then he knows that it'll emerge through prototyping at site, and at the right time we'll have the decision. So the way we do the tenders, for instance, is very different. So we don't package out a finished tender. We break it into phases. We address the critical aspects first, and we have the client as an ally in the processing. We tender out the right thing at the right time, quick enough. So these projects, like that entire long building you saw, got built at a remote site within 18 months. I mean, it was even the first hotel, that was the first architectural project. End to end, it was built in 22 months. I mean, with all the experiments and all the craziness. So it didn't really add up to being too long.
Hello, amazing project. Thank you so much. A few of us, Harish, Etta, me, and others in the room have had the privilege to go to Mumbai with Rahul about a month ago, and we're working on a very large site. And it's been really inspiring to see all your work and you working with craftsmen all around the country. Mumbai, as you know, I guess, is very developer driven, and I wondered if you had any advice on how to proceed with working with craftsmen when we are developing skyscrapers and very tall, ambitious projects. How would you proceed to bring in local expertise and we see this kind of vernacular in the very small scale, the informal housing, but we fail to see it in the large development. So how would you proceed with that?
That's a very, very scary question. I don't know. We've never been asked to do a high rise, so I don't think I have an answer to that at the moment, because it's also, I guess, a high rise is not an idea that has come from within. It's something that you're trying to do in an urban context, and it has its own set of challenges in terms of construction. And I don't know, Rahul, do you have any thoughts on that?
I just want to clarify, I'm not making them do high rise. No, I mean, I think it's a very interesting and important question. And as I've always said, that you can, if you do a high rise building, you would find in the whole country perhaps 25 contractors that can deliver it. But if you do a low rise, high density kind of thing, as we saw some examples of, you'll find 7,000 contractors who can do even up to 4 and 5 floors. So it's a matter of how one imagines those paradigms, how one challenges the codes which force us in particular directions, and actually reimagine the urban form. And that's where urban design plays an important role, because if you don't have the right paradigm for the form of the urban, then you lock yourself into bad paradigms in terms of buildings, and then these become challenges. I want to actually ask a question just while we are at it. I'm not sure I can even articulate it well, so we can have the conversation. And that's more a kind of ethical sort of question, which also as a practitioner one deals with, which is this sort of, you use the word co-produce, we try to do that. And at what point where does labor, craftsmanship, how does that whole spectrum play out, right? Because, like in the Krishi Bhavan, There were artists who came and embossed walls and things. In other projects, they are integrally part of it. And so when it becomes the construction of the steel structure, somehow it becomes labor. And somehow when we say do a beautiful perforated screen, it becomes craft, right? We all deal with this because, I mean, the whole system of construction is also set up in a way that you have contractors who have labor, and then we bring in some people who we celebrate as craft. And I mean, I don't even expect an answer. And I think just looking at your projects, your attempt to blur that by giving dignity and celebrating some of it, but making it integral components of the building already is a way of surfacing it, right? And I think this is something that I think we are all challenged with, right? How do you, in the protocols of construction, begin to celebrate these components? So again, I don't want an answer.
You know, but it's something I would love to kind of just chat about this a little further because it's something we've dealt with. So if you see even the first project, I mean, we worked with welders, they were off the street. It's, yeah, the scissors, right? And even, I mean, the act of craftsmanship, which is basically the idea of building by hand, is an act of craft. And I think so. For instance, for us, actually, the emotionally and intellectually, there is no difference. Maybe it's not come through in these projects, but for instance, if you see even the facade of the Krishi Bhavan, which is just brickwork, and but it needed to be executed with a certain degree of consciousness and partnership. And it was government project managers and government contractors who did that building. So a big part of bringing that dignity in is really, so one of the things we try and do is when we go to site, we don't, or as a part of our explaining our good for construction drawings, we try and do a site meeting where we have the masons present and the contractors present, and we present the vision of the building so that even the guy working on the electricals knows what he's doing it for. So just that idea of consciously engaging with the final outcome and what they're up to, I think brings some degree of pride. And so, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, and I think it's a bigger challenge, whether it's in Nairobi or in India. The challenge is that you're against a whole kind of enterprise of construction systems and protocols and materials, and there's certain materials that perhaps perpetuate that much more than others, and right? And hierarchies that come. No. So just I think your work just propelled that question in my mind, and of course it was beautifully dealt with, and I think it's something that as a community of practitioners who are interested in South Asia but other parts of the world, I think it's important for us to deal with. Sorry. You had a question.
Thank you, Ambrish, for your lecture and your work. My question is about a theme that was sort of very dominant in some of the early projects you showed, which is luxury, and specifically the sort of project type of the luxury hotel. Specifically in this region, it's interesting because that typology has such a deep and sometimes complicated history. Seeing the projects, I couldn't help but think of the projects of Jeffrey Bawa and how sort of that typology of the luxury hotel opens up the opportunity to integrate contemporary and regional types of construction practices, ways of working. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, what assets in your own sort of projects that's opened up willing clients, generous budgets, and how you sort of position that type relative to some of the more socially engaged projects that your practices sort of come to.
I'm not sure I've understood your question, so I'm going to try and articulate it. Your question is about how do we deal as a studio with, say, differences in clients' briefs and budgets across, say, these two typologies, say a luxury hotel or a slightly more public project. Is that your question?
Or maybe just precisely about the luxury hotel and what opportunities has that type opened up for you in the practice?
In embracing the kind of crafts and all of that.
So I would say, I mean, our first project, the one in Jodhpur, for instance, was, well, you have to meet the client to understand the kind of budgets he gives us. It did not, again, budget continued to be a huge constraint for us well into the second or third project we work with. So for instance, the conversation that I had about the choice we made for the pattern we chose to work with was as much driven by a budgetary constraint as it was, say, by an aesthetic compulsion or an aspiration we had. However, having said that, there is of course a much greater degree of freedom to be playful, to be slightly more engaged in adding value to how much, say, the operator can charge per room. That's the measure of a hospitality thing, your average revenue per key. Having said that, our learnings from, say, a project like that immediately informed the visitor center we're doing at the Mehrangarh Fort, which is being done at a shoestring budget. It's through a trust that again has very, very little money to play with. Most of our exploration of craft is almost in the nature of a prototype, to kind of, for us to learn with what will continue to stay relevant to a larger audience. So, for instance, the team that worked with us on the Jodhpur hotel, there were three masons, master masons, and two of them had sons who were studying IT, programming or coding, and no one in the family was going to take up the profession. After the project, they got so many commissions in the city, and in fact, for us, that was really a great source of pride. So a lot of, I think, our proudest moments have been just going back and meeting just people in the neighborhood and their excitement of having something new to be proud of, which gave the city a new identity. And their sons now have left the IT business. Their teams have scaled up to hundreds of masons. They're doing work all over. In fact, we couldn't afford to use them for the visitor center project anymore. So I don't know if that kind of addresses some of what you asked, or is there something still open?
Yeah, I think the finances, that was very interesting and something that came through in the lecture as well. Just an extension, do you place yourself in the history of like Jeffrey Bawa, and like how do you sort of approach that history of that type of project? Is that not importance to you, which is also valid?
Well, I'm really inspired by his work, but I don't. I'm not. I'm usually inspired by a lot of things, and I'm emotionally inspired by his approach, for instance, and other such regionalists who've kind of responded to that typology. But beyond that, I don't really. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe two or three more questions.
Thank you for this. I think there's like a continuous understanding of the place and the history of that place to begin each of these projects from. And since we were also talking about practices at the beginning of the lecture, I'm now starting to think what that plays a role in your own practice in the office, and has research been something that has been an evolving, I think, like a thematic composition before the projects actually begin or even begin to evolve? And has research played or changed in the way that it has played a role in your office?
I would love to say it has been, but to be honest, it's very spontaneous and really emerges from the project. And yes, once there's a project on the drawing board, then we're out on, at site, meeting people, meeting vendors, going to quarries, going to sources of materials and meeting, but it's really, it's just in the moment. And what we learn and pick up from is something that, because the pace of projects is usually, we don't know what's going to come to us. Say, for instance, the Krishi Bhavan project, the first thing we did was parallelly try and find someone who knew the craft, because we didn't know the craft of the region. So partnerships, turning to repositories of knowledge which already exist, because these are centuries old traditions, and we can never hope to know enough. So recognizing that and immediately turning and being willing to kind of let all those inform the project. So I think what we've become good at is orchestrating and facilitating and knowing where to give people how much freedom so that they can really contribute, so that we are not trying to control the process, because that comes in the way very often of the best work that could come out.
Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. It's a really fascinating depiction of projects that oscillate between the idea of place and space. And I was wondering if you had documented the aging of some of these projects, which incorporate a large amount of natural materials, and what are the kind of maintenance cycles that come into play after a couple of years in these projects?
So, say for instance, the Jodhpur project is now 12, 13 years old, and it's just, I mean, the strength of natural materials is that they age beautifully. So aside from the interiors, which need a regular paint job, I think the project itself, in fact, looks far richer today than it did when it was new. Again, these are perhaps just serendipitous kind of emergencies, but it's been consistently our experience that, because also we use materials that have proven, we are not experimenting. So the sandstone is what the fort is made of, right? So even the sandstone itself has cut in 7 different ways. So we turn to the craftsman to tell us which cut should we use for the facade and which cut we should use for the floor. So we are just very, very cognizant of what we don't know. And I think that's one thing that has really helped us, is staying curious, inquiring, and involving people who know a lot more than we do, and most artisans do. They know, it's just that they're not given a chance or not asked. So I think that's really helped us.
Yes.
Hi, Ambrish. Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, I mean, it's pretty clear that there's a clear proclivity towards the vernacular and handicrafts in your work. Do you have any clarity in terms of like your earliest memory that got you to gravitate towards this sort of direction? Is it, or was that maybe perhaps the kind of constraints that your first project, the project that you had showed, the interior project, the constraints that it kind of gave you, did that kind of catapult you into like thinking about handicraft and the vernacular?
I think it started, I'll try and answer that. I'll have to kind of rewind a bit. It started with just the way I grew up, and I think maybe some of us grew up where we just didn't have enough ever. So we was looking for, like even our early projects, the clients just had no money. And like even when I was building boats, I mean, we didn't have labor because my dad, we couldn't afford to hire people, and we made do with very, very little to produce the best we could. So I think that's been a paradigm that has stayed, and it's an intrinsic part, conscious part of the way we work, is that how can we do more with less, but at the same time you want to be self-expressed, you want to create beauty, you want to, like for me, telling a story, that buildings must tell a story of the place, of something beyond just the material coming together in a certain form. And I mean, it's slightly esoteric, but I do believe that the hand kind of imbues the material with an energy. And I firmly believe that a hand-built building has just a different kind of energy. So, and that's something we have tremendous access to. So I think that's where it comes from. And yeah, more than I think, yeah.
So now we really take the last 2 questions. Just grab it.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Thanks.
one there and one here, and okay, we'll take the third one. But let's take the questions, if they can be brief, so you can answer them all together.
Thanks so much for the presentation. It made me really nostalgic. I guess for any architect, it's always a negotiation between the values of the studio and the values of the client. And as you mentioned, it's all about creating shared meaning. But there's bound to be situations where the values of the client are absolutely in opposition to the values of the studio. I'm curious about what you would do in such a situation, and I guess it's a question to any architect, but specifically in the case of Lotus, what would be the absolute non-negotiables in such a situation, and when would Lotus decline a client?
I'm going to collect all the questions. Any other things?
It's just a deliberation on like the state of practice, right? Like, so I consider myself sometimes not an architect anymore, just an urban designer because I'm super disillusioned by the rich client intensiveness. But your projects show me something interesting is almost positioning the architect as a generator of work, which like the construction industry and developers are so important for the country because they're generators of work. Do you think that's a position that more architecture firms could take, but a different kind of work, because we're not going to employ 10,000 artisans, but perhaps the work of 15 artisans has that much added value? I know it's not really a question, but any commentary that you might
I
have?
think the two are sort of related, so why don't you respond to this and then we'll take the last question.
Rohit, he was my colleague at Studio Lotus at one point in time, so that's a googly thrown.
So projects do you reject it?
I don't know. But we have walked out of projects, but only in very extreme cases. Once we take something on, we give it our best. And to be honest, I have yet to find a client who is not willing to engage with adding value, whether it's something that's more sustainable or more responsible, as long as his business needs or personal needs are understood and met. And to me, that's the exciting part about mainstream practice, that can you take something like super commercial and do it in a way that demonstrates that, look, there is a different way of doing this, and demonstrate that you can do it with those values embedded. And so to that degree, it's a lot of extra effort for us to do, but I think that's also part of the excitement of being in the mainstream and being able to shift even a little bit. But yeah.
Yours was more a comment. If you want to frame that quickly as a question.
Sure, yeah. I was just wondering if this is something consciously that you do as position yourself as like a generator of work for an artisan or a new skill training for someone that you employ, or the materials you use. I was wondering if you would endorse that, and more architecture practice in India should position itself as something that generates work and hence would propagate your ideas of better material and better craftsmanship in our bigger developments as well.
Yeah, as a value, totally. Like I would kind of be an activist for the handmade, and that's something even at larger scales we're continuing to do in commercial, industrial, corporate projects. I just believe it adds so much value to the context we live in. Beyond that, it's up to the practices, I guess, to decide.
And this is kind of related to what Eda's question, or what I was responding to someone's question about scale, right? I mean, urban form generates. So, I think what's very noticeable about very evident in your work is that the building is made up of many components, which means it employs a much wider spectrum of crafts, which means more people, right, at a different scale. So the kind of granularity in terms of the choices of components that go together, which then create a much wider pool of employment, right? And I think that's, again, these are choices versus the prefabricated or versus repetitive units, 2 units that make the whole building, right? And so I think we're disaggregating the possibilities also of employment and engagement. Okay, the last question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I guess mine is a sort of broad question about just approach to working in South Asia, and maybe particularly India. I think at this school, a lot of the South Asian student contingent are international students who've had a significant degree of their education in India coming to the GSD, and maybe some plan to go back, some not. But on the flip side, there are a minority of us who were born and brought up in the diaspora and feel roots to these kinds of vernaculars in practice, but it's just maybe more of an emotional connection and interest. And I was wondering if you had any feedback or advice about potentially exploring and a point of entry into working in obviously a very different set of conditions and practice and industry itself, but just maybe high level.
In case you haven't answered the question, she's asking for a job. I'm joking.
Yeah, I mean, just go there and do it, I guess. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's nothing more, I guess. You just have to take a leap and figure it out.
So, I just want to, first of all, before I thank you, just say that, again, thanks to the South Asia, GSD South Asia. I know Pia has been interacting with me, but I see there's a bunch of you who've really helped, and thank you for, this is the first time these last maybe 2 or 3 years that we really have a critical mass of students from South Asia. There's to be 2 or 3, we have to look for them. So it's lovely to see a much broader group in a community building, and I think there are a number of things we can learn from South Asia, and I think we need to bring those conversations into our discussions much more. So thank you all for doing this. The next lecture that the GSD South Asia or South Asia GSD is organizing, and I'm just announcing it on their behalf, is the 2nd of April, and it's a lecture by Anthony Achavetti, who's a professor at Yale. He's done a seminal book called Ganga, the Water Machine. It's really a seminal book on the Ganges, and his work has been about mapping the Ganges and the hinterlands and the effects. He's been working on the tube well as a transformational instrument within that larger territorial imagination. So his work intersects design, landscape, territorial imaginations, etc. It'll be a really interesting lecture. It's on the 2nd of April. So please sort of note it. I mean, I'm sure Pia and others will send out emails. This is a very important lecture to be at, yeah? And so thank you guys again. And Ambrish, thank you very much for sharing this wonderful body of work. Thank you.